Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel and I hope you're doing well. Today we're going to show you how to get up and running with Python's FastAPI and Azure AD. So I just want to give a quick disclaimer that I am not a Python developer. I am doing Python because it was the most requested backend for this series, but I will also be doing other backends as well just because I had quite a few requests for different ones. But Python was the most requested, so that's the one that I started with. Overall, I would say it was quite simple to get up and running with Python. The biggest challenge that I had was finding the library that fit the best, and I had to experiment with a few different libraries before I found the one that I was happiest with. And so hopefully this video is quite clear cut and shows you quite clearly how to do it, and I hope it gives you the information that you want. Without further ado, let's get into the video. I hope you enjoy and I hope that it's useful. So we're going to be using FastAPI Azure Auth for our library to connect to Azure from FastAPI. The reason why I've chosen this provider is because it seemed to be the best currently supported library that does authentication with Azure for FastAPI. And whilst it's written by another company other than Microsoft, it's written by Intility, I think it's called. It seems to have great support. It has recently been updated and it's constantly updated. It has a lot of usage. People internally in Microsoft have been using it as well from like conversations that I've had. And yeah, it's a really nice library to work with. There was another library that I considered, but it hasn't been updated in like 2 years. And when I looked at the feature to feature comparisons, this was the clear winner. So this is the one that we're going to be using. We could also write our own library if we wanted to, but given that this is meant to be us getting up with Azure authentication quickly, I thought I would just use this third-party one for now. And if we did decide that we wanted to write our own library for this, we could do that in the future. So let's get started. Okay, so the first thing that I'm going to do is I am going to create a Python environment for our application. So this is just going to be the environment that we can run on to install all of our modules, install everything that we need in order to get the FastAPI up and running. So, 3. And I can't type today, so if I keep making mistakes, that's why. So now we've created our environment and we just need to activate that now. So the way that you activate that is you just call source and you go into the folder location where the activate is, and that will put you into the actual virtual environment. Once that's activated, you will see here that we are now within our virtual environment and we can start installing the things that we want to. So there are a couple of things that I need to install for FastAPI. One is FastAPI itself, and the other thing is UVcorn. And they are the things that I needed to launch FastAPI and get it up and running. So I'm just going to install those as well. And as you can see, they then get installed into both the bin folder and the library folder. So you can check that they've been installed correctly. And the only other thing that I'm going to install is the Fast Azure Auth as well. You can of course specify a version if you want to. I'm just using the latest versions for each one. So now that's all done, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to create a very, very basic FastAPI with an endpoint for a student's controller, which basically returns a list of students. So the way that I'm going to do that is I'm just going to create a file called main, which is going to have my setup in, and I'm going to have a folder for students, and I'm going to have a students file, which is going to be which is where I'm going to put the router and the endpoint. And I'm also going to have a JSON file, which is going to have the student data. And then I'm just going to go into something called Mockaroo. I really like this library. Basically what it does is it allows you to create test data, which you can just use and it'll just create dummy data for your endpoint. So I'm just going to go ahead and create some test data for my students, and yeah, I'm then going to add that to my JSON file that I've just created. I'm not going to be American, so I'm going to put it in the right format. And then I'm just going to reduce the rows for 1,000 because we don't need loads of data. We just need data to like return from the actual thing. So I'm just going to download that now. And oops, I did it in a CV. You can specify which format you want it in, and I want it in a JSON format. So I'm just going to make sure that I download it in the right format. And as you can see, it's downloaded here exactly how I wanted, and it has different names and email addresses and things like that. And it's just really useful when you need to mock things up and when you need to display things, etc. So I'm just going to put that in the students.json file now. Cool. So our students.json file is done and we are ready to use this. And so I can then use this within the actual students.python file where I'm gonna set up my router and I'm gonna set up the students.json like endpoint that returns all that those students. So let's just start creating the router. And these are just like endpoints that you can find on, and this is just documentation that you can find on FastAPI on how to basically get a router up and running. I don't know if anyone else relates to this, but whenever you feel like you're being filmed or anything like that, you just cannot type for the hell of you. And you just make lots of mistakes because people are watching you. So I'm just gonna do a open my JSON file, and then I'm just gonna return the JSON response. I'm not gonna bother doing any sort of transformation or anything like that. I'm literally just gonna return it because we don't really care too much about what is in here. We are just testing the actual endpoint and that it returns what we want. So now this endpoint is pretty much done. We just need to set up the actual like configuration for that within the main file. So we're going to set up the configuration for FastAPI and we're going to set up the configuration for the router. So there's some other like middleware we need to add. So I'm just going to add cause middleware. And this isn't necessarily going to be a problem right now, but when we connect to our front end, we do need to specify the URL that is going to be the front end to this. So I'm just going to add some cause middleware now so that we don't need to worry about doing that later. And this is just from fastapi.middleware.cause import. And then yeah, we can then add our router. So we're just gonna say we want to include our students.router, and yeah, we just need to import that as well. And there we go, and that should be everything. So what I'm just gonna do is I'm just gonna test that this works. And I'm just going to verify that we can actually launch this and it works how we want it. Okay, so I've got a little bit of an error right now. Yeah, I just incorrectly spelled that, but that's fine. So that should just have an S on the end. So yeah, that's just me being a bit silly. Typo. So if we go to localhost 800 and /docs, this will take us to the Swagger docs that get automatically generated with FastAPI. And you can see that this is the endpoint that we've configured. So if I try this out now, this should actually return the thingy, and it does not. What is the error this time? Yeah, okay, so again, just a typo, me not putting the correct students in there. So now if I execute, this should work, yes. So as you can see, I've got all of the users in there, and that's just the test data that we used. So now we've verified that we have the endpoint and it's working, we can now add the steps that are actually gonna like hide this endpoint from the public, because if this was deployed to a AWS or Azure or wherever, or Netlify or whatever, someone could access this without logging in. So let's go ahead and add our Azure Auth. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add a auth.py file, which is going to be what contains our scheme. So we need to create a scheme in Fast Azure Auth, and if you just go into the FastAPI configuration, it will tell you the scheme that you need to add. So a little bit. Yep, so here we have this Azure scheme here, which is basically the scheme, what we're going to be using. So we're deciding that we want to be using a single tenant Azure authorization code. If you remember in the previous episode, you had the option between using like a single tenant or multiple tenant, and we chose single tenant, so that's the one what we're using. But if you use multiple tenant, there is also multiple tenant setup here as well. There is also B2C setup as well if you decide to do that too. So I'm just going to add that in here, and yeah, you can just, it will recognize that it is from FastAPI, and so you can just import that. And then we just need to get the app client ID. So the app client ID for this in here is going to be the client ID of the backend. So if we go into our portal, we can go into the applications and we can see we've got a backend and we've got a front end. So I'm just going to go into the backend and I'm just going to get the client ID, which is here. Once we've got the client ID, we can then go into the auth Python file and we can go and we can put it in here. We can also go into the tenant and replace with the tenant, which is going to be this here. And then we also need to set scopes. So scopes is typically the name of the scope and then the description of the scope. So you would have access as user for the description, and then we would also go into the expose an API and actually get the name of the scope, which would be this here. There's an additional thing that I'm going to enable here, just because I am signed in as a guest onto my tenant, just because I have a lot of, because I am signed in as a guest on my tenant because I use a training email address. So I'm just going to add allow guest users, and I'm going to set that to be true, because if I didn't add this, then it would block the ability for guest users to be able to log in. So that's the last thing I'm going to do here. Obviously in your situation, it's entirely dependent on whether or not you want guest users to be enabled. You can just log it down to members of your actual tenant if you so wish. And then the last thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to configure the OpenAPI Swagger documentation. And what this is going to do is, if we look at Swagger here, for example, at the moment, you can see there's no ability to authorize your and test through here your actual endpoint. So I am going to add the ability to do that, which is this logic here, and you can just copy this and you can just say, okay, this is the Swagger Auth authentication that we are using. So I'm just going to add that, and then I'm just going to put that back to here and pass that into here. So one thing to take note on is that this here is going to be the front end client ID rather than back end client ID, because we're impersonating the front end client ID when we're testing the actual retrieval of the token. So I'm going to get the client ID for the front end as well from here. And then similarly, I'm just gonna take the scope again, and I'm just gonna use that here. I can't actually remember if it wants the full scope or if it just wants the, yes, it wants the full scope. So we just copy again the same scope that we did in the previous one. So if I just go here and I take this scope, there we go. And there we go, we have that scope. So once we've added that scope, the last thing we need to do is we need to put on this endpoint that this endpoint has a dependency on that scope. So I'm just going to see what they suggest, which is Security Azure Scheme. So we can just use this dependency here for Azure Security Azure Scheme. And that should do it, I think. So I'm just going to test that works now. So we'll see if that works. So if I refresh this now, I should get an authorize here, which is what I do. And when I press authorize, I should be able to actually authorize onto my tenant. So I'm just going to try and do that now. Right, okay, so there's a small thing that we need to do. Because we aren't actually the client, so the redirect URI is different. We just need to actually add this redirect URI into our front end application. So if we go to authentication here and we have the redirect URI, we can add this as a redirect URI. Obviously we can remove this in the future if we don't want to keep testing this way, but this is a great way if you're working locally to be able to test the back end on its own without having to go through the front end. So I'm just going to refresh that again, and I'm just going to try and authorize again now that I've added that redirect URI, and that should work. Yes, so we can see that that works now, and yeah, we can try it out. And here we go, you can see now that if we are logged in, we get a 200, and if I log out, actually, I should get a 401. Let me log out. Yeah, I get a 401 unauthorized, so you can see that actually this is authenticating on our endpoint just as we anticipated. So that's all for me today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please can you give that a like and a thumbs up and subscribe. I post on my YouTube and on my blog, and I also post daily content on my LinkedIn. Thank you for watching, guys. Goodbye.